Welcome to Digging Up Roots 2, the perception of a harmonic root in four-note tertian chords. My name is Jeremy Poprad of Kent State University, assisted by Joshua Albrecht of Kent State University. How do we determine the root of a chord? Traditionally, we name chords by stacking notes in intervals of thirds and choosing the lowest of these notes as the root of the chord. I'll be referring to this as the tertian root in this presentation. But is this tertian root always the only option for naming a chord? Let's hear an example. First, a simple chord progression played on a guitar. Now let's add a bass line under it. 1, 2, 3, 4. And now let's do it again with a completely different bass line. 1, 2, 3, 4. Which one is right? Are they both right? If we think more generally about seventh chords, which note do listeners hear as the root? Does the quality, inversion, voicing, or range influence this perception? Can there be multiple roots for certain types of chords? Here are some pairs of chords that are commonly given different names based on different roots. The first example shows how a C minor 7 chord can also be thought of as E flat 6, which is an E flat major triad with an added major sixth. Both names are very commonly used in jazz and popular music, and are thought of as different chords even though they are composed of entirely the same notes. The remaining three pairs can be viewed similarly as having both a bottom component triad and an upper one. In the last two pairs, the upper component triads are major triads, which are generally perceived as stable, whereas the bottom component triads are augmented and diminished, respectively, and are generally perceived as unstable. A quick recap of the literature on chord roots. The tertian root theory dates back to Rameau's 1722 treatise with his fundamental base principle of chord structures. Ritzma in 1962 and 1963 theorized that the overtone series played a part in pitch perception, particularly when partials in the series were absent, such as when listening to someone's voice on the phone or music on a tiny smartphone speaker. The brain filled in the gaps with what they termed residue pitch. Terhart, 1982 A and B, and later Parncut, 1988, expanded the residue pitch idea into a system of calculating chord roots using an imagined overtone series resulting in virtual pitch. Empirical studies on chord roots are hard to come by. Roberts and Shaw, 1984, had participants listen to pairs of triads and answer whether they were the same. Participants were most accurate with major triads, and less so with other qualities, were more accurate in root position, and less so in inversions. Smith's 1967 dissertation examined the perception of roots in melodic intervals, and Hurwitz's 1970 dissertation did a similar exploration of harmonic intervals. This study is a follow-up to Poprad 2021, where the perception of harmonic roots of triads were tested. All four qualities were tested in two voicings, all inversions, over a one-octave range that generally encompassed the bass clef register. Results generally agreed with tertian root theory, but varying in strength similar to the findings in Roberts and Shaw. Participants were the most accurate at choosing the tertian root for major triads and were slightly less accurate for minor triads. For augmented triads, the bottom note was chosen the most often, and for diminished triads in first inversion, the root and third were chosen nearly as often. This leads to the hypotheses that this study investigated. If the upper or lower component triad is major or minor, its root will be chosen frequently. If the upper or lower component triad is augmented or diminished, its root will be chosen infrequently. If the upper triad is major or minor, these roots will be possible competing roots against the tertian root. The bass note will be chosen more frequently overall. The stimuli for this study consisted of recordings of seventh chords played as block chords on a sampled grand piano generated in Kontakt and Reaper. Here are some examples of the stimuli. The seventh chord qualities were chosen by combining all four triad qualities with both major and minor sevenths, plus the addition of the fully diminished seventh chord, which is a diminished triad and a diminished seventh. Three voicing types were used: closed, where the notes are as close together as possible within one octave, plus drop 2 and drop 3, which are spread out across 2 octaves. Drop voicings are generated by beginning with a closed voicing and dropping a specified note from the top down an octave. This usually results in a different inversion, so the voicing must be inverted back to the root position. There are three additional drop voicing types, but they are all spread further apart than these. The previous study found that participants were less accurate identifying tertian roots with wider voicings than closed ones, so this study used the three most compact voicings. In total, there were 99 stimuli examples composed of 8 qualities and 3 voicings each and 4 inversions each. Due to the perfect symmetry of the fully diminished 7th chord, inversions were not included for this type, resulting in only 3 additional diminished 7th examples. The range presented to participants was randomized. The bass notes ranged from G2 to F-sharp 4. Also recorded was whether the bass note of each stimuli was in the lower or upper half of this range. This study was presented as an online web browser-based survey. First, a series of demographic questions were asked of the participants, followed by the 99 stimuli, and finally a debriefing portion. Here's a screenshot of the stimuli portion of the study. One of the 99 stimuli recordings would play, and participants could hear it again by clicking on the multiple note icon, or hear each individual note by clicking on the 4 single note icons. Participants would choose which note they heard as the root, rate their confidence in their answer, and submit. Participants were recruited from social media posting and from an undergrad Theory 2 class at Kent State. The sample size was 32, composed of 19 males, 13 females, and 0 non-binary or non-reporting. Ages ranged from 18 to 76, with a mean of 36.1 and a standard deviation of 18.9. The demographic survey included 13 questions forming the Allen Musical Sophistication Index. The OMSI formula then generates a musical sophistication score that ranges from 0 to approximately 1,000. Participant OMSI scores for this study ranged from 223 to 1,000, with a mean of 687.5 and a standard deviation of 264.6. And now for the results. Overall, looking at all chord tone selections from participants for all chord qualities combined, the tertian root was chosen significantly more often than the other chord tones. Separating these results out by chord quality, beginning with major 7, there is an even more pronounced selection of the tertian root over other chord tones. This, as well as all other remaining qualities to follow, was significant. Dominant 7th chords also had a similar distribution favoring the tertian root, and again for minor major 7 chords, though not as large of a difference. Minor 7 chords, however, showed something new. The root and the third were both chosen frequently, at 36% and 31% respectively. This is consistent with the equivalence of minor 7 and major 6 chords discussed earlier. Likewise, for major 7 sharp 5 chords, while the root was chosen more often than the 5th or the 7th, the third was chosen most at 38%. The third in this chord quality forms the bottom note of a component major triad, whereas the actual tertian root is the root of the less stable augmented triad. Dominant 7 sharp 5 is back to the tertian root being selected most often. This is the only chord quality where the upper 3 notes do not form a tertian triad, so while the root forms an augmented triad, there is no upper component triad to compete with it. Diminished major 7 is also quite an interesting result. The root of this chord was chosen at a similar percentage to the 3rd and the 5th, but the 7th was chosen far more often at 40%. This note, the 7th, is the root of the component major triad versus the tertian root being the root of a diminished triad. The half-diminished 7th chord results also demonstrated a situation of competing roots, supporting the example of the equivalent half-diminished 7th and minor 6th chords. The roots of each here are represented by the tertian root and the tertian third, chosen at nearly the same percentages, with 34% and 32% respectively. Lastly, the fully diminished 7th chord showed a preference for the bottom note, which is consistent with the previous study's findings for a similarly symmetrical augmented triad. Measuring the effect of chord quality on chord tone selection was significant. Here, all of the previous horizontal bar graphs are combined into a vertical mosaic graph. The range of the bass note was not a significant influence on chord tone selection. Lastly, the effect of the OMSI musical sophistication scores on how often participants selected tertian roots was significant. Generally, the higher a participant's OMSI score, the more their answers agreed with tertian root names, although with only an R-squared of 0.22. Overall, most of the results agreed with tertian root theory. All 4 of the example equivalent chords given at the beginning of this presentation were found to be situations where competing roots existed, particularly when the upper component triad was major. OMSI scores had a significant positive effect on the selection of tertian roots, and the bass note range was not a significant influence on chord tone selection. For future directions, I've already completed gathering data for a follow-up study where non-tertian 4-note chords were used as stimuli. Data analysis is currently underway. As all of the stimuli in this study, as well as the previous one and the in-progress follow-up, were isolated block chords with no context, a worthwhile topic to investigate would be the effect of chord progressions, keys, and other harmonic contexts on the perception of roots. The results of this study have practical applications in ear training pedagogy, particularly in situations with competing roots. Also, this could be applied to create more accurate automatic chord identifying algorithms for software. This concludes the presentation for Digging Up Roots 2, the perception of a harmonic root in 4-note tertian chords. Thank you for watching.